Hello, watercolorists. We're going to be practicing our value scales today, which means that we're going to be practicing controlling the pigment and the water in order to create different shades of our paint. We're going to be working with blue, and I wanted to point out these three different blues that you see on my little medium test sheet. Those three blues are from my personal watercolor set. And each blue on the right is with more water, and then the pigment on the left is more pigment. So the more water you have, the lighter your color will appear. The more pigment, the darker. And I'm going to be working with the blue from the watercolors I was able to provide in your virtual art kit. However, if you're working with a different blue, keep in mind that your blue that you're using is going to look different based on that pre-made color. So that's why I wanted to share with you those three blues that I had, and they are going to look a little different. The tones of those blues are different than this blue we're working with today. All right, so we're gonna start with blue first, and then you'll be able to pick any color that you want. We're gonna need a paintbrush, your water cup, any piece of paper that you have, preferably one that's mixed media provided in the art kit. And you're also gonna need a paper towel, Kleenex, something to wipe your paintbrush on. Whatever you have around you will work. I did move the set of colors to the clear part of the tray so that I can use the white part of the tray for mixing. I want to be able to see how much pigment I have and how much water I have when I'm trying to make different shades of this blue. I used more pigment on my brush because you can see that the blue came out pretty dark. So now if I add more water, I'm gonna get a lighter shade of this blue. So I'm gonna add a little bit of water to that blue that I touched in the white lid, and when I go to my paper, it should be lighter. So try to experiment with a few marks to make a darker shade of blue and a lighter shade of blue. Once you have a few marks made, I'm going to get pigment on my brush, and I want to show you if you let the brush continually make one long brush stroke, you'll see that it naturally will run out of pigment and the tone of this color will be lighter. So it went from dark blue all the way to light blue. So go ahead and try, get paint on your paintbrush and use your paintbrush to paint one long stroke across your paper so that you can see your blue shift from dark all the way to light. Now we're gonna set up a value scale of blue. So we want our dark blue to transition into lighter shades of blue until they're super light blue, and then all the way to the white of the paper. I'm gonna go ahead and sketch out a value scale, and you should have 6 squares or 6 boxes in order to create your different shades. I'm not going to hard outline them so that they don't take away from the watercolor. I just want some general idea of where they should go. And then with watercolor, it's actually best to work from light to dark. So you can choose to work left to right with light to dark, or right to left with dark to light, however you want to do it, also based on if you're right-handed or left-handed. But whichever way you do start, remember we're gonna keep one square, the white of the paper, and then we're gonna start mixing light shades of blue. I like to put water on the palette, and then I'm going to drop in the blue pigment just a little bit. So I'm using the corner of my brush to just touch that little water droplet, just to add a little bit of blue pigment, just to get started on a light shade of blue. And it looks like it's going to be pretty light, but I want to make a little test mark just above, and it is lighter than the light blue I created earlier, so I am going to use this for my first shade of blue. I'm going to paint that box in. And then, with that little blob that we have in the paint tray, I'm actually just going to keep adding blue pigment to that in order to make that spot darker. I think I actually used up all of the water, so I'm going to start a new one, and I'm going to go back to my blue pigment. I'm using just the tip of my brush to touch the blue paint and then mix that pigment into the water, testing it out to see if I made it to be darker than the last shade I created. It's really helpful to see your water and your pigment in a mixing tray or palette so that you can control how much pigment you do need to drop into that little area on your palette, or if you need to start to make a different one depending on what shade you're going for. For this medium shade of blue, I had a new drop of water, and I am adding 4 drops of the blue pigment to that new little pool of water. 4 didn't seem to be enough, so I added a 5th drop of the blue pigment, and it did create the medium shade of blue that I was looking for. So when you get in a nice rhythm, you can pay attention to how many drops you used, and then you can just add more drops of the pigment to the blob of water in order to gradually darken that blob of water that you're working with. The brushes you're working with also make a difference. Larger brushes are going to hold more water, so it is really about getting comfortable with the brush you're using and being in control and aware of what is on your brush. I did outline the area for our white of the paper, and then we have one last spot which should be the darkest blue we can get. So we want to load our brush with pigment, no water. The water should only be used to activate the color, and since my brush was already wet, you can see that I'm just going back to that paint pigment oval, and I just keep touching my brush to it, so I'm loading up more and more blue pigment onto the brush. I was able to add enough blue, so I went ahead and I cleaned my brush off, and I'm going to let this value scale dry, and then once we finish our second one, we can take a look at this blue value scale and see if we need to go back and layer to deepen any of the values. For this next value scale, I'm going to choose to work with the color black, so I will create a scale based on shades of gray leading up to black. You can pick whatever color you want at this time. And I'm also going to work with the brush that was provided in the paint set. And I'm going to make a few marks just to test out what I have on my brush so far. Then I'm going to create a very light shade of black using a lot of water and a few drops of black, and then work my way from a light gray to medium grays and then dark black. For this value scale, feel free to speed up if you want to skip to a certain area or rewind to watch another part over again. This is intended for you to use as your own practice, and if your value scale doesn't turn out how it should the very first time, that's okay. You're going to need to do another one. It is going to take practice. Also, towards the end of this value scale, I do show you some ways to change the value and lighten up if you went too dark too soon, or maybe if you need to add more pigment to make your layers even darker. So again, fast forward, rewind as needed, and do as many value scales as you need in order to feel more comfortable with controlling your water and controlling the pigment to create varying shades of your colors. To create a color that looks exactly like the color in the pan can be tricky. However, what you can do is use less water and more pigment. So you'll see that I keep taking my brush back to the black pigment, also because black is such a powerful color, so that I can load my brush up with as much pigment as possible, and my brush is almost dry. You can see that the texture of the paper was showing through. I'm only getting a tiny bit of water. I really just touched the very top of the brush just to activate the black again, and then I'm going to put the watercolor on my paper, and then I'm going to go straight back to the paint. Make sure I have way more pigment than water on my brush. I might even need to do a few test marks or go back to my paper towel to get any extra water out, and then head back to that black pigment. So as my value scale was drying, I noticed that the shade next to the black looks very similar to the middle shade. So I'm gonna try to add more black pigment and layer on top of that to deepen that shade. And then the last value that's supposed to be light gray, it ended up being darker than I wanted it to be, and that needed to flow to go from light to dark. So I added water to my brush, and I'm lifting the pigment up off the paper. And I'm gonna do this to the second shade of gray as well, because it doesn't transition as smoothly either. So I'm using clean water, and I'm rubbing that pigment, and I'm lifting up the pigment off the paper, and then I'm using the paper towel to blot that area. And I took a little bit too much off, so I'm gonna go back in with a little bit of gray and then paint that in. Lifting is great for any areas that you need to change the color, or you might have had pigment or water get in an area that you didn't want it to be, so you can take just water on your brush, and it's almost like you're erasing what just happened, lifting some of that pigment up off the paper. So do any touch-ups as needed. Check over your value scale to make sure it transitions from the lightest shade to the darkest shade possible. And well done on your watercolor practice.